Xtalks is the industry leader in connecting life science, food, healthcare, and medical device professionals. The Xtalks Life Science podcast features insightful conversations with industry experts about all things pharma, biotech, and more.
Hello and welcome to the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. I'm Ayesha Rashid, Senior Life Science Journalist at Xtalks.com. And this week, I'm delighted to introduce a very special guest on the show, as always. We have with us today Dr. Shaharyar Khan, who is the co-founder and chief scientific officer at Rivus Pharmaceuticals, a company developing a new class of investigational medicines called controlled metabolic accelerators, or CMAs, for cardiometabolic diseases like diabetes, heart disease, heart failure, and MASH by targeting obesity. Dr. Khan is an expert in the field of mitochondrial biology and the development of mitochondrial-based therapeutics. Dr. Khan has more than 2 decades of experience managing multidisciplinary teams of mitochondrial biologists, computational and medicinal chemists, as well as clinicians. Prior to his role at Rivus, he co-founded Gencia Biotech, where he also served as chief scientific officer and pioneered multiple drug discovery programs, including large and small molecules aimed at harnessing the unique role of mitochondria in the maintenance of cellular health. Dr. Khan earned a BA in philosophy from the University of Virginia and holds a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Virginia as well. To learn more about the landscape of drug development for cardiometabolic diseases, let's turn to Dr. Khan now. Thank you so much for being on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And so I'd like to start off by asking you, Dr. Khan, can you tell us a bit about your journey and really your interest in a field, a kind of a niche field like mitochondrial biology, and how it links to cardiometabolic diseases, and really what led you to focus in this particular area? What inspired that interest and piqued it?
No, it's a great question. It's something I've been wrestling with for most of my adult life, and that was this challenge of really beginning from first principles. All activity, life, how we navigate the world, how life happens is dependent on energy. And though it's maybe a bit trite to say, mitochondria are the energy factories of the cell. In some real sense, that is true, and it has important implications, not only for the possibility of life, but how life ensues, grows, evolves, and importantly, how disease happens. And so, beginning with those first principles was, really the foundation of trying to wrestle and understand how we should interpret and understand disease, that gave rise to my efforts across, whether it was in the PhD where I focused on in Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease, really trying to understand them from a bioenergetic basis, to cardiometabolism and how we're tackling cardiometabolic disease at Rivus by, again, attending to the mitochondria and the mitochondria's seminal function in generating energy.
Indeed. I think, growing up and throughout school, high school, we always learn about the importance of the mitochondria being the powerhouse of the cell and all of that. And to really see that being translated into not only understanding disease biology, but to really be able to develop therapeutics that are targeting those mechanisms. And I think that, coming full circle in that way, I think it's really fantastic to see how you're so focused on such an important aspect of disease, pathophysiology in various diseases, and of course, cardiometabolic diseases. And so what led you to co-found Rivus after gaining that expertise and really recognizing the importance of the field? And so what led you to Rivus?
Well, I think we had this. The previous company was Gencia, and we had been developing a series of assets that were focused on modulating various aspects of mitochondrial function. And we had a collection of small molecules that could modulate what we call mitochondrial uncoupling. And that is this process whereby it's a natural process. Every one of our cells participates in it. And it's how we modulate the metabolic rate. It was those molecules that we wanted to leverage across this really important areas of unmet need, focused initially on MASH, NASH, and then heart failure, but essentially going after these diseases of obesity. So we had these assets that we wanted to develop into those areas at Gencia, and so we created a new co that became Rivus, that was essentially focused on leveraging this really important biology of modulating your metabolic rate by inducing mitochondrial uncoupling in a safe and controlled fashion, hence controlled metabolic accelerator. That was the birth of how Rivus came to be, and how we took the learnings from Gencia and those assets and created what we hope is introducing a new therapeutic paradigm for treating diseases associated with obesity.
Indeed. And so, in terms of when we talk about current unmet needs in diseases like heart failure, MASH, NASH, as you mentioned as well, diabetes, how do they? I think it's been long recognized that these are diseases related to obesity, but how is Rivus addressing the underlying causes and mechanisms of obesity and how they relate to some of these diseases?
I mean, maybe this belies my background in philosophy. We began with first principles and said, well, what is a overarching conceptual framework that we can give to obesity to help us then dissect out potential therapeutic opportunities and areas of unmet need? And we began with this conceptual framework of, obesity in some very simplistic way arises when you have a differential between energy intake, food consumption, and energy expenditure. And it's that balance between the two that gives you your essentially your metabolic set point, and whether or not you're going to accumulate adiposity and adipose tissue and fat, or whether that fat is not going to accumulate. And so beginning with those first principles, that essential conceptual framework, we looked at the landscape and said, well, we've got all these drugs that are being developed on the energy intake side of the equation, but there's this lack of approach that leverages the energy expenditure side of the equation. And so this is where, again, the mitochondria is, the organelle par excellence of targeting energy expenditure. It's your primary, um, uh, uh, means by which energy is expended. And we had compounds that were able to modulate that. And so this was a very different way of conceiving of obesity. It relied on increasing energy expenditure. Again, in a simplistic way, if the GLP-1s and approaches going after energy intake are the diet side of the equation, this would be the exercise part of the equation, the energy expenditure. And what we wanted to do was look across the obesity spectrum and say, well, this is a disease that has a trajectory. This is a disease that has multiple manifestations. Where might energy expenditure be better placed and better able to attend to the pathobiology that is driving that particular phenotype, whether it's heart failure, MASH, or essentially aging. It's this part of the obesity equation where we think energy expenditure is better to target. So, for example, if you're in your 70s and you have heart failure, you can ill afford to have a significant reduction in your caloric intake because you might have comorbid or a comorbidity of sarcopenia. You might not have a lot of muscle mass. And so in that scenario with that sort of phenotype, you'd be better served to increase your energy expenditure than reduce your caloric intake. And so that's how we sort of began to conceptualize, um, uh, if we have this broad conceptual framework of energy intake and energy expenditure, where might energy expenditure be better placed? And where might that prove more therapeutically advantageous than simply reducing caloric intake?
Indeed. And, one of my next questions was going to be what distinguishes Rivus's approach from other companies, the kind of a typical question. And I think, that everything that you outlined, that speaks to it all. Really, traditional approaches really focusing on the energy intake, but the approach that Rivus is undertaking is looking at the other end of the equation with energy expenditure. So that's definitely a differentiating factor, and that's something that we don't hear about a lot in terms of a pharmaceutical or therapeutic approach, at least. So that's so fantastic to hear.
You're absolutely right. And it's a particular challenge for Rivas to communicate. I think we have some colloquial sort of understandings of energy intake and energy expenditure. It's frequent. People say, well, I can't do anything about my metabolic rate. My metabolism is slowing as I age. I can't do anything about that, or maybe I can exercise and recover some of that metabolic rate that I've lost as I've gotten older. Well, our approach allows you to do that pharmacologically and aids in that process to do so pharmacologically. And it leverages this natural mechanism that every single one of our mitochondria use on a daily basis to modulate metabolism. We're able to advantage the increase in your metabolic rate so that you can counteract the ravages of age. You can counteract the challenges that obesity bring, and particularly as you age. And we see these age-associated disorders where we think that increasing energy expenditure will provide just a better experience for patients, better outcomes for patients, and will enable you to better benefit from interventions like dietary interventions. So it's this amalgam of effect that we think energy expenditure provides that has not been appreciated and investigated to date, and we're the first to do so.
That's truly very, very exciting, and just to learn about the approach. And I can imagine undertaking it. It's probably, being on the cutting edge, as they so quote unquote, so to say. That must be truly very, very exciting. So very, very cool to learn about. So for sure. And in terms of the indications that you're pursuing some of your candidates in, can you speak to us about that? I know that you mentioned MASH, NASH, heart failure, diabetes, but how, in terms of what specific candidates are being developed in these indications, where are they in terms of clinical development and things of that nature?
Yeah. So our first-in-class molecule, HU6, it's completed 2 phase 2 trials and will complete its 3rd phase 2 trial imminently, and will launch into longer-term studies and phase 3 studies for the indications that you mentioned, really focused again on those areas of unmet need. And I think to help conceptualize where those areas are, it helps to understand the trajectory of obesity. Obesity is not just a simple phenotype. It's this spectrum of disease and spectrum of trajectories over the course of a lifetime in many cases, where you may begin with just sort of general obesity, a high BMI. Over time, that develops into insulin resistance to frank diabetes. In some patients, they'll express that as a metabolic manifestation in the liver would be MASH. The cardiac manifestation would be HFpEF. And you begin to see across the spectrum these trajectories that essentially end up with patients that are elderly, might have sarcopenia, reduced lean body mass, reduced skeletal muscle mass, frail, excess of adiposity that is further challenging their physiology and their biology. And we want to help those patients. We want to help those patients that, as a consequence of this trajectory over time, end up in a place where maybe they're ill-served by a GLP-1. Maybe they shouldn't be experiencing significant reductions in their caloric intake. Maybe they already are, in a sense, malnourished, and providing them the opportunity to increase their energy expenditure and the attendant benefits, having more mitochondria, better mitochondria, that translates into improved quality of life, being able to do more, being able to feel better, and then ultimately having better outcomes. That's precisely sort of how we conceive and how we imagine the trajectory of our efforts in this area, and of the pharmacology that we think provides for that differentiation, that can be achieved with our lead molecule HU6, but our follow-on molecules as well. Again, reconceptualizing the energy balance equation towards energy expenditure.
And what has the data from some of those trials shown so far? And what kind of promise are you taking forward to larger or later phase trials?
Yeah, so as we've prosecuted into longer and longer term studies in these areas of unmet need, and expanding into broader populations, into patients who might be earlier in the trajectory of their obesity, of their disease. What we've seen, for example, in the heart failure population, is that we're able to induce a fat-specific weight loss that is preferential for visceral fat, which is really interesting. It seems if you look across these diseases, especially as you get older, it's harder and harder to lose weight. More and more of that fat and that weight is visceral adiposity. It's producing all of these evil, cytokines, all these evil humors. It's causing physical restrictions on the ability of your heart to pump, for example, with adipose tissue encasing the heart, or it's causing a significant increase in pro-inflammatory and pro-fibrotic signaling in the case of liver fat. So these effects that are happening, and what we're seeing with by increasing energy expenditure versus simply dietary restrictions alone, is that those particular adipose stores that are the hardest to lose when you diet are the first to go when you increase energy expenditure. And so our hypothesis is that those particular fat stores also tend to have more mitochondria. They tend to be more bioenergetically active, and as a consequence of utilizing this mitochondrial mechanism, we're getting access to those particular adipose stores, and that's translating into benefits like reductions in inflammation, reductions in adipose tissue that we think over long-term studies will translate into improvements in quality of life and function. And we're beginning to sort of peel that away in these populations, for example, with heart failure, where we see significant benefit on cardiac measures. So the heart is doing better. And that's precisely what we'd expect by reducing those adipose components that are really driving the disease, that are often the hardest to lose with diet alone.
Wow. And so in terms of some of these diseases, targeting the underlying obesity component, are there specific patients that would benefit more so? Would it be those obese patients, or let's say people with normal BMIs? Is this approach something that they could benefit from as well? Or are those disease mechanisms slightly different perhaps in that kind of a population?
It's a great question. We're learning more about it every day. So there's a very influential concept that was offered by Martin Brand. It's called the uncoupling to survive hypothesis. And it's this idea that a significant amount, and really raises the question, why do mitochondria uncouple? Why is there this metabolic rate? Why do we generate heat? Why are we endotherms? And why do we have a body temperature? A significant part of that is that the mechanism of mitochondrial uncoupling not only modulates metabolic rate, but it also modulates your production of free radicals by the mitochondria. And those free radicals are responsible for a number of both inflammatory and fibrotic, and many have hypothesized age-associated phenotypes and age-associated mechanisms. So we think that as we prosecute across this obesity spectrum, there is the opportunity to utilize this mechanism and this pharmacology in disease areas where they're at lower doses, where there might not be a need for increasing metabolic rate, but there would be a need for reducing reactive oxygen species burden, mitochondrial damage, and improving your mitochondrial health and abundance. And so it's precisely what we're looking at. We're beginning to see some of those signals. For example, HU6 causes, even at the lower doses, a 5 to 8 millimeter mercury reduction in blood pressure that's independent of metabolic rate. And we think that it's acting at the vascular endothelium and improving the health of the vascular endothelium, and that's translating into a blood pressure reduction. And of course, that anticipates significant improvements in outcomes, and that's what we're looking at. So it's a new biology. We're learning a lot with every trial, and I think it's very clear that it has far-reaching ramifications that we will continue to prosecute.
Indeed. And in terms of drug development, are there any specific or any challenges that are unique to cardiometabolic diseases or the specific approach in targeting mitochondrial energy and uncoupling compared to, let's say, other pharmaceuticals or?
Yeah, it's a great question. Something we think about all the time, and we you know really, in introducing any new pharmacology, it's not simply about the data. It's also about, in essence, winning hearts and minds and addressing potential, whether it's legitimate concerns or any potential misconceptions around the mechanism. And so we are we're very careful and thoughtful about monitoring any safety issues, as you would be with any new mechanism, because we're working at the heart of, no pun intended, at the heart of metabolism. We monitor for things like body temperature. We monitor for any untoward changes in your metabolic rate. We're also trying to anticipate and understand the dose response of HU6 and controlled metabolic accelerators, and that's where we've benefited tremendously from this literature that supports how your metabolic rate is regulated and how to assay and understand that metabolic rate. So we have beautiful models of our exposure and the resulting changes in metabolic rate. And that gives us a lot of confidence about our dose selection, and why, even though we've been in these different populations, whether it's MASH or whether it's type 2 diabetics or whether it's heart failure or simple obesity, we can, with great confidence, select doses that we have, that we're all but certain will work and induce an increase in the metabolic rate. So it's the advantages of working in this area, the challenges of working in this area, but most of all, really introducing a new pharmacology and making it a viable option for patients and their healthcare teams.
And in terms of, I would say, evolution of the field, as they say, and advancements, whether technological or just advancements in our understanding of the biology of the diseases that you're pursuing, what have been sort of some of the most critical or advancements in the field that have really led to, I mean, if we talk about GLP-1 agonists, of course, that's kind of an obvious one, but what has been sort of what have been the key advancements in the fields that have allowed for sort of, if we can say, in terms of like really advancing, what I'm trying to say is basically in terms of advancing options for some of these diseases, because I think for decades it's been, okay, if you have issues with your heart or with diabetes, diet and exercise. But now we're hearing more about, therapeutics. And so what have been sort of the key advancements, again, whether technologies or biology, that have allowed for us to now sit here and have these kinds of conversations, and for Rivus to be undertaking the work that it's doing?
No, I mean, it's a great question. I think, looking back at the landscape 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 20 years ago when I started, there was this, I think, tacit understanding, appreciation for how, or that obesity was an important contributor to these diseases. But we didn't have the tools and we didn't have the data that uh, was that definitively uh, 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 definitively determined that obesity was at the heart of these diseases. And it's a testament to the GLP-1s. It's why the Nobel Prizes will be awarded for those discoveries, because it changed the way we conceptualize MASH. It's changed the way we conceptualize heart failure. It's changed the way we conceptualize diabetes. It's really put obesity front and center as a major health catastrophe that we can have solutions for, that are meaningful, that translate into patients feeling better, doing better, living longer, and living better, importantly. And so it really was, we went from, there used to be something called the obesity paradox. And that was that BMI, which is an imperfect measure at best. You'd see this, patients with high BMI and then with very low BMI doing worse in terms of outcomes. So there was this idea, well, maybe there's a healthy range of BMI, even if it's in the, nudging into the obese spectrum. Well, that was inaccurate because BMI is, again, an imperfect measure. It doesn't take into account, for example, how you hold your body habitus, how much skeletal muscle mass you might have. And what we're learning is that actually your skeletal muscle mass is a very important determinant of your disease progression. And so that again emphasizes to us that these simple conceptual frameworks have their advantages, but they should always be remembered as simple conceptual frameworks, and each patient should be taken on their own merit and dealt with it on an individual basis. And what we're trying to do is provide them the therapeutic options to be able to do so. So not everyone is going to be well served by a GLP-1. Some people who might be better served. I mean, you brought up, we have this phenotype, particularly in South Asians, of thin NASH. So these are patients who have, MASH and fatty liver disease, but don't have the high BMI of what you would typically expect. And in those patients, what you almost invariably see is that they have very little lean body mass, little skeletal muscle mass. So they still have significant adiposity and fat. It's just that, again, their phenotype is a little different and doesn't fit into our conceptual frameworks. So it was those discoveries and the impact that the GLP-1s were having across this very wide spectrum of disease that indicated to us that, yes, obesity is lying at the heart of things. And yes, we want to be able to treat that obesity, to treat the spectrum, and that took 20 years. And now we want to introduce that energy expenditure is an important way of treating that. And we think it's part of this almost logical progression and evolution of how we treat this a major determinant of disease.
And I think you touched on this, but an important aspect when you're developing something so novel or taking such a unique niche approach is convincing different stakeholders. And so, can you speak to us about some of the stakeholders that Rivus is working with in terms of partnerships, collaborations, whether in industry as well as academia, and how important also are another stakeholder that we in terms of patient centricity, really the patient and caregivers and all of those partners as well. So how do you move forward and work with all of these stakeholders, and who are they for Rivus?
That's a great question, and an important part of the challenge of introducing any new pharmacology. It very much begins with the patient. And it's the patient experience actually that is a primary motivator for what we're working on. We believe that not everyone is going to be well served by simply cutting calories. In fact, as I've mentioned, many patients, particularly as they're older, would be ill served by that approach alone. And I mean, not to be crass, but you don't want to starve grandmom. It's just not a nice thing to do. You want that patient's experience to be a positive one. You want it to be invigorating. You want it to be something that translates into an improvement in their quality of life and in how what they can do with their remaining years. And so that was a motivator behind trying to increase energy expenditure. Could we help our older patients experience weight loss without having to cut calories? Could we help them achieve an improvement in their cardiovascular fitness by providing them an increase in their metabolic rate so that they were burning more fat just by sitting there? And would that translate over time into the kinds of improvements that we would expect by exercising your mitochondria, by having a healthier, more robust mitochondrial cohort, and maintaining your muscle mass, if not improving it? And so we're beginning to see those changes. It begins with a patient-centric approach, and our primary stakeholder is the patient. But I think it goes without saying that as physicians look across these therapeutic options in this landscape, they see their patient better than anyone, and they can determine, what will better serve their patient. And we want to be able to provide them, as a society, alternatives that would attend to their patient needs. And so a lot of that will involve, getting our steering committees, our key opinion leaders that inform our decision making, that help in understanding the patient and the patient experience, are key stakeholders in these discussions that we have on a daily basis around our pharmacology, HU6, and the development path of our efforts. So then, of course, regulators are important. A critical part of how that development happens, and I think it goes without saying that that they're absolutely critical, more so now than ever. And so we involve them very early on, and they're a critical part of how we conduct our trials, of how we want to provide them the necessary data that supports introducing a new pharmacology.
Indeed. And in terms of, we talked about some of the trends or advancements that have led to where the field is today. Where do you see the field heading in the next couple of years and what trends, technologies, and whatnot. AI, the implementation of AI. There's, there are arguments whether are we using AI just for the sake of using AI, or so how are some of these technologies going to be beneficial in driving drug development further, and especially in cardiometabolic diseases? And so where do you see things heading in the next couple of years?
Well, so we're obviously, if we've attended to and been faithful to our original conceptual framework of the energy expenditure equation, we will have options that attend to both as a single molecule that both increase energy expenditure and reduce energy intake. It's what we're working on at Rivus, and we're using AI to implement the two pharmacologies into a single small molecule, once daily oral, because we do think that the combination of those pharmacologies will advantage both. And we have preclinical data showing that there are synergies between the both. And and maybe it's not that difficult to conceive. I think we all have friends who they can eat what they want, and their metabolism is fast, and they never gain any weight. And I know certainly as I've aged that it's harder to your metabolism slows, and you have to be that much more vigilant and attendant to what you're eating. So having a pharmacology that's able to do both, we think would be really the next generation of approaches. It'll be important to have options, and I do see a general trend towards particularly amongst investors, what compound or what peptide is going to cause the most amount of weight loss in the shortest period of time. I don't think that's healthy. I don't think that's healthy for the patient. I definitely don't think that's healthy for us as a society. But what is, and that is that the quality of weight loss is better, more sustainable, that it is fat directed, and leads to, we still don't have a therapy that is disease modifying in the regulatory sense of disease modification, i.e. that if you stop taking it, you would have changed the course. And as we know, the GLP-1s, the weight regain is rapid and almost exclusively fat. So that's where I see the future, is the combination of those pharmacologies that can give you a more sustainable, better quality weight loss, that can stave off the ravages of time and age, that can change the trajectory of obesity and obesity associated diseases that are therapies that are disease modifying, and leveraging AI to be able to do so. It's, again, precisely what we're doing at Rivus. It's what's given birth to the next generation of molecules. And it's not only in terms of determining which compounds and developing those compounds, but we're also leveraging AI for which patients. And so it is a new dawn, a new era. And there's a lot of promise, but it all comes down to execution. And we at Rivus have benefited tremendously, and we're executing.
So wonderful to hear. And so what can we expect from Rivus in the coming months, let's say this year and in the next couple of years?
Well, we'll have a major readout from our MXL study, which is a 6-month trial in patients with evidence of fibrosis and fatty liver disease, MASH, and that will help determine our trajectory forward in MASH, the doses, and exactly how we conduct our next trial in MASH. We're, of course, looking very carefully at longer-term studies in heart failure, obesity, diabetes, and associated disorders. And then we're leveraging our understanding of this pharmacology for our next generation of molecules that will expand into areas where we're clearly seeing therapeutic benefit, and the potential for leveraging AI into these areas where we think this pharmacology will will prove beneficial irrespective of whether or not there is an adipose component. So it mentioned hypertension and atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, a primary killer of human beings. So expect a lot and expect great things, and looking forward to communicating the amazing results as they come.
And we look forward to keeping an eye out for all of those really exciting developments that you've outlined, and really looking forward to the work that you're continuing to lead at Rivus. And we want to wish you the best of luck, and hope to stay in touch. And Xtalks will definitely be, again, keeping an eye out for all of the latest and greatest from Rivus. So, Dr. Khan, thank you so much for your time and insights today, and for sharing all of the amazing work that you're leading at Rivus.
Thank you so much, and thank you to your subscribers. Excited to share these results and introduce a new way of conceiving of disease and a new pharmacology that can make a difference.
Indeed, indeed. All right, that's the end of this episode of the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. If you liked today's show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Thank you, everyone, and we will see you next week. Bye for now.
To join the Xtalks community, visit Xtalks.com and register for exclusive access to curated content like live webinars, news articles, and educational videos. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speakers sharing them and should not be taken as professional advice, nor do they necessarily reflect the policy or position of Honeycomb Worldwide. For further information, email us at podcast@xtalks.com.